I shuddered as Evelyn's words echoed through the pristine walls of my supposed new home. In this house, you'll learn to know your place. You're not family. You're just an outsider. My heart sank, but I forced a polite smile. Thank you for having me, I replied, clinging to Jack's arm as he squeezed my hand reassuringly. Evelyn's cold gaze swept over me with contempt before she turned away, barking orders about unpacking. As Jack helped carry our luggage upstairs, a sense of dread crept over me. Later that morning, I found myself alone in the vast kitchen, scrubbing every surface until my hands were raw. Remember, you have the cleaning to finish up before lunch. Evelyn's shrill voice rang out, and I flinched. Yes, Evelyn, I murmured, my shoulders slumping. This was not the warm welcome I'd envisioned. It was a stark contrast from just a year ago when Jack had proposed, his eyes shining with love. I never thought I'd find someone like you, Sophie. Will you marry me? Tears of joy had filled my eyes as I breathlessly accepted, unable to imagine a life without him. We were supposed to start our happily ever after together, but fate had other plans. Jack's job transfer meant moving to his hometown, and Evelyn had insisted we stay with them until we found our own place. At the time, her offer seemed genuine. I'm so glad you're here, Sophie. We're like family already. She had gushed, embracing me warmly. David, Jack's father, had echoed the sentiment. Welcome to your new home. Foolishly, I had believed their welcoming facade, comforted by the idea of having family nearby. But within days of our arrival, the truth unraveled. You call this clean, do it again, and do it right, Evelyn had sneered, scrutinizing my efforts. When I tried to explain, she cut me off with a glare that chilled me to the bone. As the weeks passed, the abuse escalated, and I found myself drowning in a sea of impossible demands and endless chores. Desperate, I confided in my godmother, Rachel. Aunt Rachel, I don't know what to do anymore. I had sobbed into the phone, my voice trembling. Her firm tone offered solace. Come to me, dear. You don't have to go through this alone. With Rachel's guidance, I began documenting the mistreatment, determined to break free from this nightmare. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. As I lay awake that night, my mind drifted back to happier times before this living hell began. Jack and I had met at a mutual friend's party, and from the moment our eyes locked, I knew he was special. We spent countless nights talking, sharing our dreams and aspirations over cheap wine and greasy pizza. Jack made me feel alive in a way I'd never experienced before. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, he had whispered one evening as we strolled hand in hand through the park. My heart raced, and I could barely form the words. I want that too. A few months later, Jack proposed in that same park, getting down on one knee as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. I never thought I'd find someone like you, Sophie. Will you marry me? Tears of joy streamed down my face as I nodded fervently. Yes! I can't imagine my life without you. We were polar opposites in many ways, but our love transcended any differences. While I was a free-spirited artist, Jack was a driven businessman. Yet we complemented each other perfectly. Little did I know that our blissful union would be shattered by the very people who should have welcomed me with open arms. After the wedding, Jack's company offered him a prestigious promotion, but it required relocating to his hometown. Reluctantly, we agreed, naively believing Evelyn and David's promises of support. We're so excited to have you both here, Evelyn had gushed, pulling me into a suffocating embrace. You're family now. David had nodded enthusiastically, patting Jack on the back. Our little boy is finally settling down. In those early days, Evelyn doted on me, offering to help with meal planning and household chores, but it didn't take long for the mask to slip. This isn't how I do laundry, she'd snap, rewashing entire loads despite my protests. Gradually, her demands escalated, and any attempt to reason with her was met with a torrent of insults and criticism. Useless, just like your mother, she'd hiss, her eyes blazing with contempt. Jack tried to intervene, but Evelyn played the victim, accusing me of disrespecting her in her own home. Slowly, she drove a wedge between us, exploiting Jack's blind devotion to her. Trapped in a cycle of abuse, I began to lose myself, my once vibrant spirit dimming with every cruel remark and impossible task. But Aunt Rachel's phone call reignited the spark within me, reminding me of my strength and worth. With her guidance, I started documenting every incident, compiling a dossier of evidence against my tormentor. Evelyn had no idea the gathering storm brewing, oblivious to the tsunami of karma barreling towards her. With Aunt Rachel's support, I felt a renewed sense of determination. She had promised to gather evidence against Evelyn and her shady business practices, but first, I needed to play along and keep up appearances. "You look radiant today, Evelyn," I said with a forced smile as she strutted into the kitchen one morning. She paused, eyeing me suspiciously, before a sickly sweet grin spread across her face. "Why, thank you, dear. I'm so glad you're finally learning." I suppressed a shudder, focusing on the pancake batter I was mixing. Evelyn sidled up beside me, running a perfectly manicured nail along the counter. "You know, Sophie, I had my doubts about you at first," she began, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you're shaping up to be a decent daughter-in-law." My grip tightened on the whisk as she continued. "Of course, you'll never truly be part of this family, but at least you're trying." I opened my mouth to respond, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Ah, ah, ah! Don't ruin the moment with your incessant chattering." Swallowing hard, I nodded and returned to my task, grateful when she finally sauntered away. Later that day, as I was scrubbing the floors, Evelyn cornered me again. "You missed a spot," she sneered, pointing to an immaculate tile. "Honestly, Sophie, it's like you're not even trying." Before I could protest, she grabbed the bucket of soapy water and upended it over my head. I gasped, sputtering, as the foul-smelling liquid drenched me from head to toe. "Oops, clumsy me," Evelyn laughed, her eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Now you'll have to start all over again." As she sauntered away, I fought back tears, my hands trembling with rage. How dare she treat me this way? I was her family, her daughter-in-law, not some servant to be abused and humiliated. But I knew better than to retaliate. Not yet, at least. Instead, I meticulously documented every incident, compiling a mountain of evidence against the woman who had made my life a living hell. In the evenings, Jack would return from work, oblivious to the daily torture I endured. Evelyn was an expert at putting on her saccharine mask, playing the doting mother and gracious hostess. "How was your day, darling?" she'd coo, kissing Jack's cheek as he entered the kitchen. He'd smile tiredly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Exhausting, but it's all worth it to provide for my family." My heart would clench at his words, knowing that in Evelyn's twisted mind I was nothing more than an outsider, a burden to be tolerated. Still, I clung to the hope that one day Jack would see the truth, the monster lurking beneath his mother's carefully crafted facade. With Aunt Rachel's help, I knew that day would come sooner than Evelyn could ever imagine. The days blurred together in a haze of endless chores and verbal abuse. No matter how hard I tried, Evelyn always found fault with my efforts. "This kitchen is a disgrace," she spat one morning, surveying the immaculate countertops with disdain. "I could eat off these floors, and they'd be cleaner." I bit my tongue, refusing to rise to her bait. Evelyn prowled closer, her perfectly coiffed hair swaying with each step. "Well," she snapped, her eyes narrowing, "don't you have anything to say for yourself?" Stealing my resolve, I met her gaze evenly. "I've cleaned everything as instructed, Evelyn." Her lips curled into a sneer. "You call this clean? Do it again, and do it right." As she turned on her heel and stormed out, I felt the familiar sting of tears pricking my eyes. No matter how meticulously I worked, it was never enough for her. Later that afternoon, Evelyn caught me folding laundry in the living room. "Those creases are atrocious," she tutted, snatching a freshly pressed shirt from my hands. Before I could protest, she grabbed the iron from the board and pressed the scorching metal directly onto the fabric. The acrid stench of burning cotton filled the air as the shirt disintegrated beneath the searing heat. "There?" Evelyn smirked, tossing the ruined garment aside. "No more creases." I stared at the charred remains, my hands trembling with rage and disbelief. How could someone be so cruel, so utterly devoid of compassion? As the weeks dragged on, Evelyn's torment escalated to new heights. She would berate me for hours, finding fault with every aspect of my existence. No task was ever completed to her satisfaction, no effort deemed worthy. "Useless, just like your whore of a mother," she'd hiss, her words cutting deeper than any knife. I longed to scream, to fight back against her relentless onslaught. But I knew any retaliation would only give her more ammunition, more reason to turn Jack against me. So I endured, clinging to the hope that Aunt Rachel's plan would succeed. I documented every vile act ever inflicted upon me, building an ironclad case against the woman who had made my life a waking nightmare. Meanwhile, Evelyn played the part of the devoted matriarch to perfection whenever Jack was around. Her saccharine smile and sickly sweet words were a stark contrast to the venom she spewed the moment his back was turned. "How's my favorite daughter-in-law?" She'd simper, pulling me into a suffocating embrace as Jack entered the room. I'd force a tight-lipped smile, my muscles aching from the strain of maintaining the charade. "Just wonderful, Evelyn. You're too kind." Jack would beam, oblivious to the dark truth lurking beneath the surface. In those moments, I hated him for his blind devotion, his unwavering trust in the monster wearing his mother's skin. But deep down, I knew the fault wasn't his. Evelyn had spent years cultivating her carefully crafted facade, lulling everyone into a false sense of security before revealing her true, twisted nature. I vowed to be the one to tear that facade down, to expose her for the vile, manipulative creature she truly was. With each passing day, my resolve hardened, fueled by the knowledge that justice would soon be served. Evelyn had no idea the storm brewing on the horizon, the tsunami of karma barreling towards her with unstoppable force. Her reign of terror was nearing its end, and I would be the one to deliver the final, devastating blow. As the weeks crawled by, Evelyn's torment showed no signs of relenting. If anything, her cruelty only intensified, fueled by some twisted desire to break me completely. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner dishes, a sudden crash made me jump. I whirled around to find Evelyn standing over a shattered vase, her face contorted with rage. "You stupid, clumsy girl!" she screeched, advancing towards me with balled fists. "Look what you've done!" "I didn't," I stammered, backing away instinctively. Before I could finish, her hand lashed out, striking me across the face with stinging force. I gasped, my cheek burning as tears welled in my eyes. "Don't you dare talk back to me," Evelyn snarled, looming over me like a predator cornering its prey. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I was done being her punching bag, her verbal and physical target. Trembling with equal parts fear and fury, I reached for my phone and dialed the one person I knew I could trust. "Aunt Rachel, I don't know what to do anymore," I choked out between sobs, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief pause, then her familiar tone, firm and reassuring. "Come to me, dear. You don't have to go through this alone." Relief washed over me, tempering the rising panic. Aunt Rachel had always been my rock, my guiding light through life's darkest storms. If anyone could help me escape this nightmare, it was her. Evelyn must have sensed the shift in my demeanor, for her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Who are you talking to?" she demanded, snatching the phone from my hand. I flinched, bracing for another blow, but she simply sneered and tossed the phone aside. "No one can save you from me, Sophie. You're mine now, to do with as I please." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to show fear. Not anymore. With Aunt Rachel's help, I would find a way to break free from Evelyn's clutches once and for all. Over the next few days, we formulated a plan. Rachel would use her connections to investigate Evelyn's shady business dealings, gathering evidence of her misdeeds. Meanwhile, I would continue documenting the abuse, building an airtight case against my tormentor. "We'll bring that monster down, Sophie," Rachel vowed, her voice steely with determination. "She'll pay for what she's done to you, I promise." I nodded, my resolve strengthened by her unwavering support. No longer did I feel alone, trapped in a cycle of helplessness and despair. For the first time in months, I dared to hope for a future free from Evelyn's toxic grip. Of course, maintaining the charade around her and Jack grew increasingly difficult. Evelyn seemed to sense my newfound defiance, her taunts and mind games escalating in response. "What's wrong, dear? You look positively miserable," she'd purr, her sickly sweet tone dripping with false concern. I'd force a tight smile, biting back the torrent of rage simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm fine, Evelyn, just tired." Her perfectly manicured nails would trail along my arm, sending involuntary shivers down my spine. "Well, we can't have that, can we? Perhaps you need a little motivation to perk you up." The implied threat was clear, but I refused to cower any longer. Soon, very soon, the tables would turn, and Evelyn would finally get the comeuppance she so richly deserved. Just as Aunt Rachel and I were putting the final pieces of our plan into motion, a bombshell rocked the Benson household. Jack called an urgent family meeting one evening, his face etched with worry. "I have some difficult news," he began, running a hand through his tousled hair. "Our biggest client just pulled out of their contract. They're taking their business elsewhere." David slammed his fist on the table, his eyes wide with panic. "What? That account is half our revenue. How could this happen?" As the two men debated the dire financial implications, Evelyn sat in stony silence, her perfectly painted mask slipping ever so slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with quiet fury. "It can't be. It must be Sophie's doing." I recoiled as if struck, incredulous at her outrageous accusation. "What are you talking about? I had nothing to do with this." But Evelyn was beyond reason, her eyes blazing with barely contained rage. "Don't play dumb with me, you scheming little witch. You've been plotting against us all along, haven't you?" Jack tried to intervene, ever the peacekeeper. "Mom, that's enough. Sophie wouldn't she?" Evelyn cut him off, rounding on me with bared teeth. "Think about it, Jack. Ever since she wormed her way into our lives, things have gone downhill. This is just the latest in her twisted games." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but she pressed on relentlessly. "She's a cancer, poisoning everything she touches. We have to cut her out before she destroys us completely." David looked shell-shocked, torn between siding with his wife or his only son. Jack, bless his heart, tried valiantly to calm the situation. "Mom, you're not thinking straight. Sophie loves me. She would never intentionally hurt this family." His words only seemed to enrage Evelyn further. With a feral snarl, she lunged towards me, her perfectly manicured nails aimed straight for my eyes. I barely had time to flinch before Jack intervened, restraining his mother with surprising strength. "Enough!" he roared, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by righteous fury. "I won't let you treat my wife this way. Not anymore." For a brief, shining moment, I dared to hope that the blinders had finally fallen from Jack's eyes, that he would see Evelyn for the vile, manipulative creature she truly was. But old habits die hard, and Evelyn was a master of deception. Her expression shifted in an instant, crumpling into one of hurt disbelief as fat crocodile tears spilled down her cheeks. "My own son," she sobbed, pressing a trembling hand to her chest, "defending that snake over his own mother's well-being." Jack faltered, his resolve visibly wavering as the guilt trip took hold. Evelyn seized the opportunity, clinging to him with a desperate, almost feral intensity. "Think about what you're doing, Jackie. Think about your father and me, the people who raised you and loved you unconditionally. Are you really going to throw all that away for her?" And just like that, the spell was recast. I could see the conflicted emotions warring across Jack's face as he instinctively pulled away from my outstretched hand. I need some air," he muttered, stumbling from the room in a daze. As the door slammed behind him, Evelyn turned to face me once more, her expression triumphant and devoid of even an ounce of remorse. "You see what you've done, you wretched girl?" she hissed, advancing on me like a snake poised to strike. "You've turned my own flesh and blood against me. But mark my words, this war is far from over." Her words chilled me to the bone, but I refused to be cowed. Not anymore. Thanks to Aunt Rachel's diligent efforts, the evidence against Evelyn was mounting by the day. Soon she would face the ultimate reckoning, the consequences of her cruelty laid bare for all to see. The game was nearing its end, and this time I would be the victor. In the aftermath of Evelyn's explosive outburst, a tense silence descended over the household. Jack avoided me like the plague, haunted by the seeds of doubt his mother had so expertly planted. Evelyn, for her part, reveled in the discord she had sown. Whenever we crossed paths, she would grace me with a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Trouble in paradise, dear," she'd simper, trailing a perfectly manicured nail along my cheek. I'd stiffen, biting back the torrent of rage threatening to spill forth. "Not at all, Evelyn. Jack and I are fine." Her laughter was like nails on a chalkboard. "If you say so, Sophie, but we both know the truth, don't we?" The words hung heavy in the air, an unspoken challenge that set my teeth on edge. In the meantime, Aunt Rachel's investigation was bearing fruit. She had uncovered a staggering paper trail of Evelyn's shady dealings, embezzlement, bribery, you name it. The evidence is damning, Sophie, Rachel murmured during one of our clandestine meetings. This should be more than enough to take that monster down for good. Relief washed over me at her words, tempering the growing sense of dread gnawing at my core. Soon, this nightmare would be over. I could finally break free of Evelyn's toxic grasp and start anew with Jack, far away from her poisonous influence. At least, that was the plan, until Evelyn went nuclear. It happened one evening at the dinner table. Jack had been brooding in silence throughout the meal, his brow furrowed with unspoken turmoil. Evelyn, ever the instigator, decided to poke the hornet's nest. "You've been awfully quiet lately, dear," she crooned, spearing a forkful of salad with deliberate precision. "Cat got your tongue?" Jack tensed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his utensils. "Just leave it, Mom." But Evelyn was relentless, her voice taking on a sickly sweet edge. "Or perhaps you're still stewing over that little episode the other night? You know, when your darling wife tried to destroy this family?" The words hung in the air like a lead weight, and something inside me snapped. I could no longer remain silent in the face of her blatant lies and manipulation. "I spoke to Aunt Rachel," I blurted out, ignoring Jack's startled look, "and she spoke to your biggest client." This whole situation was inevitable. Evelyn's perfectly sculpted mask faltered, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. "What did you say?" Emboldened, I pressed on recklessly. "Your company has been mismanaged for years, Evelyn. All Aunt Rachel did was point out the problems to your client, problems you conveniently chose to ignore." The air crackled with tension as Evelyn processed my words. Then, like a snake striking, she exploded in a burst of feral rage. "How dare you?" she screeched, launching herself across the table with talons outstretched. "You're ruining everything." Plates and glasses shattered around us as Jack tried in vain to restrain his mother's frenzied assault. David looked on in stunned silence, utterly paralyzed by the unfolding chaos. In that moment, everything crystallized for Jack. As he met my gaze, terror and heartbreak warring in his eyes, I knew the scales had finally fallen away. His mother's true nature, her vicious cruelty and boundless greed, was laid bare before him, a hideous truth he could no longer ignore. The blinders were off, and the facade had finally crumbled to dust. Evelyn Benson, matriarch and master manipulator, had been exposed, and she had no one to blame but herself. The aftermath of Evelyn's meltdown was nothing short of cataclysmic. As the dust settled and the shattered remnants of our once pristine dining room came into focus, an eerie silence descended. Jack was the first to break it, his voice thick with a potent mix of anguish and barely restrained fury. "Mom, what have you done?" Evelyn, always the master of deflection, immediately shifted into victim mode. "Me?" she wailed, clutching her carefully tousled hair. That snake is the one who's turned you against your own family." But her fragile guise was already crumbling, the cracks in her facade widening with each frantic excuse. David, for his part, seemed to be viewing his wife through new, painfully clear lenses. "Enough, Evelyn," he rumbled, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by a grim resolve I'd never witnessed before. "The jig is up. We know what you've done." Evelyn's perfectly painted mask slipped completely at his words, revealing the snarling beast lurking beneath. "You pathetic old fool," she spat, rounding on her husband with balled fists. "After everything I've sacrificed for this family, this is how you repay me?" A cruel laugh ripped from her throat as she whirled to face me once more. "And you conniving little bitch? You think you've won, don't you? That you can just waltz in and destroy everything I've built?" Jack stepped between us, shielding me from his mother's wrath. "Mom, you've done enough damage. Leave now before I call the police." His words seemed to douse Evelyn's fury in an instant, her expression shifting from outrage to disbelief. "Jackie, you can't mean that. I'm your mother." But Jack was immovable, his jaw set in a hard line as he steeled himself against her manipulations. "Not anymore. The woman I knew is gone, replaced by this monster." Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth, but the words kept pouring from him in an unstoppable torrent. "You've lied, cheated, and abused everyone around you for far too long. Well, no more. I want you out of this house and out of our lives for good." An anguished wail tore from Evelyn's throat as the reality of her situation finally sank in. "No. Please, Jackie, I'll do anything. Just don't." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Jack simply shook his head, his expression a mask of grim determination. I gave you too many chances, Mom. This is the path you chose. As Evelyn dissolved into a pathetic heap of sobs and recriminations, David stepped forward, his face etched with a weariness I'd never seen before. You heard him, Evelyn, he said, his voice laced with defeat. Pack your things, we're done. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for the once formidable woman crumpled at our feet. Almost. But the memories of her cruelty, her vicious torment, were still too raw, the scars too fresh. As David ushered his wife from the room, Jack turned to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Sophie, I'm so sorry. For everything. I opened my mouth to respond, but he barreled on, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. You were right all along. I was blinded by her lies and manipulation. I should have protected you, stood up for you. Gently I took his hand, feeling the weight of his anguish in the trembling grip. It's okay, Jack. You couldn't have known. But he was already shaking his head, his expression haunted. No excuses. I failed you in the worst way possible. But I promise, from now on, things will be different. As I gazed into the eyes of the man I loved, I saw a renewed sense of purpose burning within their depths. The shackles of Evelyn's toxic influence had finally been shattered, and we were free to start anew. It would be a long road to healing, but we would walk it together, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. Evelyn's reign of terror was over, and in its wake, a new chapter was just beginning to unfold. The room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken truths and veiled accusations. I stood across from Marcus, my husband of 5 years, the man who once promised to be my rock, now the source of my deepest turmoil. Marcus, we need to talk about your mother, Helena, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. He sighed, a dismissive sound that had become all too familiar. Evelyn, can we not do this now? I've had a long day. This can't wait, I insisted. Every time we visit your parents, your mother corners me about why we haven't had kids yet. You know why, Marcus. You said you didn't want them, but to her, I'm always the one at fault. Marcus avoided my gaze, focusing on a spot just past my shoulder. You know how she is, Evelyn. Just let it go. Let it go? My voice rose, a mixture of frustration and disbelief coloring my words. I can't keep being the scapegoat for a decision we both made. He finally looked at me, his expression an unsettling blend of annoyance and detachment. You're making a big deal out of nothing. She's just being a mother. You wouldn't understand. That stung. I wouldn't understand? Because I don't have children or because I don't work anymore? The memory of my old job as a marketing consultant flashed in my mind. I had left it at 32, plagued by health issues exacerbated by stress. Now 35, I was healthier, but trapped in a different kind of stress, one that Marcus seemed oblivious to. Look, I don't want to argue, Marcus said, his tone dismissive. Can't you just handle it? It's what you're good at. Handle it. Those words echoed in my mind. That's all I had been doing since we got married, handling things. His indifference, his mother's invasive comments, the weight of unspoken expectations. I realized then that the man I married, the one who used to appreciate my presence, who used to say he was lucky to have me, had changed. Or perhaps he had always been this way, and I was just now seeing it. The revelation was as painful as it was liberating. I was not the woman Marcus or Helena thought I was, a mere fixture in their perfectly constructed world. I was Evelyn, and it was time they both remembered that. Fine, Marcus, I said calmly, I'll handle it. But remember, every action has its consequences. As I walked away, leaving him in his uncomfortable silence, I felt a flicker of something powerful within me. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was the beginning of a resolve to no longer be invisible in my own life. The incessant ticking of the living room clock was the only sound, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Helena, my mother-in-law, sat across from me, her eyes scrutinizing, as if she were trying to unravel a mystery that she couldn't quite grasp. So, Evelyn, she began, her voice laced with a deceptive sweetness, it's been quite a while since you and Marcus got married. Don't you think it's time you gave me a grandchild? The question, repetitive and invasive, hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't the first time she had broached the subject, and each time she made sure Marcus was conveniently absent. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain composure. Helena, as we've discussed before, this is a private matter between Marcus and me. Oh, but you're the woman in this relationship, she countered sharply. It's your duty to bear children. Or is there something wrong with you? You know, in the old days, women who couldn't have children were considered, well, let's just say, less of a wife. Her words stung, a deliberate jab to my self-worth. I felt a surge of anger, but I held it back. Responding in kind would only give her the satisfaction of knowing she had gotten under my skin. There's nothing wrong with me, Helena, I replied evenly. It's a decision we've made together. Marcus agrees. Marcus? She scoffed. He's just being considerate of your shortcomings. A real woman wouldn't deny her husband a family. I was taken aback by her blatant rudeness. It was one thing to insinuate, but to openly call into question my womanhood was a new low, even for Helena. Is that what you truly think of me, Helena? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I needed her to acknowledge the venom in her words. She leaned forward, a cold glint in her eyes. I think a woman's role is clear, and you, my dear, are failing in yours. I wouldn't be surprised if Marcus started looking elsewhere for fulfillment. The threat was clear, and it sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about nagging anymore. It was a calculated attack on my marriage, my character. As she continued to spew her archaic beliefs, I realized that Marcus had been allowing this to happen. He never stood up for me, never corrected his mother's misconceptions. He had left me to fend for myself against her. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. I was not just battling Helena's prejudice. I was also fighting Marcus's indifference. It was a two-front war, and I was suddenly very aware that I had been fighting it alone. I excused myself from the room, Helena's mocking laughter following me. In my bedroom, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was strong, resilient. She was someone who deserved respect, not disdain. I made a silent vow then I would no longer be the passive recipient of Helena's cruelty. It was time for her to see the consequences of her actions. And as for Marcus, he would soon have to choose a side. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the breakfast I had prepared. As I arranged the plates, my mind was preoccupied with the upcoming trip for my mother Leah's 60th birthday. The idea of a surprise getaway to Aspen, a place she had always dreamed of visiting, brought a rare smile to my face. Marcus walked into the kitchen, his eyes glued to his phone. "Morning," he mumbled, barely acknowledging my presence. "Morning. I wanted to talk to you about next weekend," I said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "We're going to Aspen for my mom's birthday. I've planned a little surprise." He finally looked up, his interest piqued. "Aspen, huh? Staying somewhere nice?" I nodded. "A beautiful resort. It's going to be special for her." He sipped his coffee, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Sounds expensive. You sure we can afford it?" "I got a great deal," I reassured him. "And it's important to me. We rarely do something nice for my parents." Marcus shrugged. "As long as it's not too lavish. You know how I feel about unnecessary spending." His response stung. It was always about money with Marcus, never about the sentiment. I pushed down the hurt, focusing on the positive. "It's all arranged. We just need to pack and show up." The day of the trip arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. As we drove to the resort, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Marcus had been unusually quiet, lost in his own thoughts. Upon arriving at the resort, my heart sank. There, in the lobby, were Helena and Richard, Marcus's parents. My surprise for Leah was now overshadowed by their unexpected presence. "Marcus, what's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably. I thought it would be nice to invite my parents, too. They deserve a break. I was speechless. This was supposed to be about my mother, our time with her. "You invited them to my mother's birthday getaway, without even asking me?" Helena stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Why, Evelyn? We're family. It's only right we share in these lovely occasions." The situation was spiraling out of control. I looked at Marcus, searching for some sign of understanding, some acknowledgement of his betrayal, but there was none. The confrontation that followed was heated and painful. Accusations were hurled, old resentments surfaced. Helena's true nature was on full display, her words laced with venom as she belittled my efforts and my family. I had reached my breaking point. The realization that Marcus would always prioritize his mother's wishes over mine was a painful awakening. I had been living in a fantasy, hoping for a change that would never come. As I retreated to our room, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but it also ignited something within me. A determination, a resolve to no longer be a pawn in their selfish games. It was time for a change. It was time for Helena to understand that her actions had consequences, and for Marcus to realize the cost of his indifference. The Aspen Resort, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, should have been a haven of peace. Instead, it had become an arena for family tensions. Helena's presence, uninvited and unwelcome, cast a shadow over what was meant to be a celebratory occasion. I watched as Helena and Richard mingled with my parents, Leah and David. The contrast between their attitudes was stark. My parents, ever gracious and accommodating, tried to make the best of the awkward situation. Helena, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the discomfort she had caused, her comments laced with passive aggression. Marcus was oblivious to the tension, or perhaps chose to ignore it. His indifference to the entire situation was infuriating. I pulled him aside, needing answers. "Marcus, you need to explain. Why did you invite your parents without discussing it with me?" I demanded, my voice low but firm. He seemed taken aback by my tone. "Evelyn, they're my parents. Why shouldn't they be here? Besides, it's not like we see them that often." "Not that often? We see them almost every weekend." My frustration was boiling over. This was supposed to be about my mother, our time with her. You've completely disregarded my feelings. "Evelyn, you're overreacting," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "It's just a weekend. We can all enjoy it together." His casual dismissal of my feelings was like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the growing anger. "This isn't just about the weekend, Marcus. It's about respect, something you clearly lack." Before he could respond, Helena's voice cut through the air. "Evelyn, dear, are you causing trouble again? You should be grateful we're here to liven up this little gathering." Her words were like a match to tinder. I spun around to face her, my patience exhausted. "Grateful? Helena, you've done nothing but intrude and belittle me since you arrived. This was supposed to be a special occasion for my mother, and you've turned it into a spectacle." Helena smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "Oh, Evelyn, always so dramatic. You should learn to appreciate family more. After all, we're the only ones you've got." The condescension in her tone was unbearable. "Appreciate? You mean tolerate. I've tolerated enough, Helena. Your constant meddling, your derogatory comments. It ends now." Richard, who had been a silent observer until now, finally spoke up. "Evelyn, let's not make a scene. It's just a misunderstanding." "No, Richard, it's not. It's a pattern," I countered. "A pattern of disrespect and manipulation. And I'm done being a part of it." The air was thick with tension, the conflict reaching a boiling point. I knew then that this weekend would be a turning point, one way or another. The veil of cordiality had been lifted, revealing the true dynamics of our family, and there was no going back. The next morning dawned with a tense atmosphere, the fallout from last night's confrontation hanging heavily in the air. I found myself in the resort's elegant dining hall, a place of beauty that felt oddly suffocating under the current circumstances. As I sipped my coffee, lost in thought, Helena approached me with her usual air of superiority. "Evelyn, I hope you've thought about what you said last night. It's not too late to apologize and make things right." Her words, dripping with condescension, ignited a fire within me. "Apologize? Helena, it seems you've misunderstood the situation. I'm not the one who should be apologizing." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You've been nothing but a thorn in our family's side since the day you married Marcus. It's high time you learned your place." Her blatant disrespect was appalling. My place, Helena? And where exactly is that? In the shadows, silently enduring your insults. Marcus, overhearing our exchange, joined us with a look of exasperation. "Evelyn, can't you just let it go? Mom means well." "Means well?" I repeated, incredulous. "Your mother has been undermining and insulting me at every turn, and you've done nothing but enable her behavior." Before Marcus could respond, a well-dressed man approached our table. He was the resort manager, and his arrival brought a momentary pause to our heated exchange. "Mrs. Helena, I must ask you to refrain from causing further disturbances," he said politely but firmly. We value the comfort and peace of all our guests. Helena's face reddened with anger. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? Yes, I am aware, the manager replied calmly. However, respect and decency are required from all our guests, regardless of their status. As Helena sputtered in indignation, the manager turned to me. Mrs. Evelyn, if there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable, please let us know. I was about to thank him when Helena burst out. This is absurd. We're being treated like commoners because of her. It was then that the true twist of fate unfolded. The manager, looking directly at Helena, spoke in a tone that commanded the room. Mrs. Helena, perhaps you are unaware, but this resort is owned by Mrs. Evelyn's family. We have been instructed to treat all our guests with equal respect, including you. The revelation hit everyone like a tidal wave. Helena's face drained of color, her usual bravado crumbling. Marcus looked at me, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. As such, the manager continued, I must insist on proper conduct during your stay. The tables had turned, the power dynamics shifted in a way Helena had never anticipated. For once, she was at a loss for words, her usual arsenal of insults failing her. I looked at Marcus, his eyes finally meeting mine. Marcus, this is more than just about this weekend. It's about us, our marriage. I need a husband who stands by me, not one who hides behind his mother's skirts. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time he seemed unsure of what to say. The realization that he had underestimated me and the situation was dawning on him. As Helena and Marcus processed the new reality, I felt a sense of empowerment. For too long I had been under their thumb, but now the truth was out in the open. It was a moment of reckoning, and I was ready to face it head-on. The shock of the revelation about the resort ownership lingered in the air, palpable and heavy. Helena's usual domineering demeanor had dissolved, leaving her visibly shaken. Marcus, too, was unusually quiet, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. As we gathered for breakfast, an uneasy silence enveloped the table. My parents, Leah and David, exchanged concerned glances but remained respectfully quiet. Richard, Marcus's father, seemed equally uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Helena and me. Helena, struggling to regain her composure, broke the silence with a forced laugh. Well, this is quite the surprise, Evelyn. Owning a resort, you've been keeping secrets. Her attempt to lighten the mood fell flat. I met her gaze squarely. It's not about owning a resort, Helena. It's about respect, something you've consistently failed to show. Marcus finally spoke, his voice laced with a hint of desperation. Evelyn, let's not do this here. We can talk in private. No, Marcus, I replied firmly. We've had enough private talks. It's time things were said openly. Richard, who had remained silent, chimed in. Helena, maybe we should have a word outside. But Helena was not to be silenced. I don't see why everyone is making such a fuss. We're family, aren't we? Family shares. Shares, yes, but they also respect each other's boundaries, I countered. Something you've never understood. Marcus's expression was one of conflict, torn between his loyalty to his mother and the dawning realization of her manipulative behavior. Evelyn, I'm sorry. I didn't know this would happen. Sorry isn't enough, Marcus. Your mother's actions and your inaction have shown me where I stand in this family. My voice was steady, but my heart ached with the weight of the truth. I can't be part of a family that treats me like an outsider. The words hung in the air, a final acknowledgement of the chasm that had grown between us. Helena's face was a mask of disbelief, her usual tactics rendered useless in the face of plain truth. Richard, sensing the gravity of the situation, took Helena's arm, urging her to leave the room. As they exited, Helena's parting look was one of resentment, not remorse. Marcus remained, his eyes pleading for understanding. Evelyn, please, we can work this out. But the resolve within me was unshakable. Marcus, it's not just about this weekend. It's about every unacknowledged insult, every moment you chose to ignore my feelings. I can't be in a marriage where I'm constantly undermined and disrespected. Standing up, I left Marcus at the table, his pleas fading behind me. The decision was painful but necessary. I had endured enough, and it was time to reclaim my dignity. As I walked away, I felt a mix of sorrow and strength. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt in control of my destiny. In the weeks following the tumultuous weekend at the resort, life had taken an unexpected turn. The decision to end my marriage with Marcus, though agonizing, brought a newfound sense of freedom. I had chosen to walk away from a relationship that had become a shadow of what it once promised. As I sat in the cozy office of the resort, now my place of work, I reflected on the events that led me here. The resort, a family legacy, had offered me a sanctuary and a new beginning. Working here wasn't just a job, it was a reclamation of my identity, away from the shadows of Helena and Marcus's influence. The door opened, and my uncle, the owner of the resort, and a man I deeply respected, walked in. "Evelyn, how are you settling in?" he asked, his eyes warm with genuine concern. "Better than I expected," I replied, smiling. "Thank you for this opportunity, Uncle. It means more than you know." He nodded, understanding the unspoken words. "You've always been strong, Evelyn, stronger than you realized." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a colleague, bringing news that would add a final twist to my story. "Evelyn, you might want to see this," she said, handing me a local newspaper. The front page carried a story that was both shocking and vindicating. Helena and Marcus had been involved in a public altercation, one that had escalated to the point of police intervention. The article detailed Helena's attempt to control Marcus's life, even post-divorce, leading to a heated exchange that had spiraled out of control. As I read the article, a mix of emotions washed over me. There was a sense of vindication, seeing Helena's true nature exposed for all to see. But there was also sadness, a poignant reminder of the man Marcus could have been, if not for his mother's overbearing influence. My uncle's voice brought me back to the present. "Evelyn, remember, you're not defined by their actions. You've moved on to better things." He was right. I had moved on, both in location and in spirit. Working at the resort had brought challenges, but it had also brought a sense of accomplishment and recognition that I had sorely missed. My efforts were valued, my opinions respected. It was a stark contrast to the life I had left behind. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing more confident, more sure of my path. The resort, with its bustling activity and diverse clientele, was a world away from the stifling environment of my previous life. I often thought about Marcus and Helena, wondering if they ever realized the extent of their actions. But those thoughts were fleeting, mere shadows of a past I had chosen to leave behind. In this new chapter of my life, I was no longer just Evelyn, the overlooked wife, the disrespected daughter-in-law. I was Evelyn, the capable and respected professional, the woman who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. As I looked out of the office window at the bustling activity of the resort, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, filled with pain and betrayal, but it had led me here, to a place of growth and self-discovery, and for that I was grateful.